The wind didn't howl here. It screamed. It came off the ridge, like something alive and furious, slamming into the eastern wall of Firebase Kestrel, with a force that vibrated the corrugated steel down to its anchor bolts. Snow didn't fall. It moved horizontal, white and blinding, erasing the world past 20 yards in every direction. Sergeant First Class Derek Hollis pressed his back against the inner wall and watched a strip of duct tape flutter loose from the cracked window frame. He didn't fix it. The tape had held for 6 days. It had stopped trying. Firebase Kestrel was dying. Not in the dramatic, explosive way that soldiers sometimes imagined in training exercises. No heroic last stand, no music swelling beneath the percussion of automatic fire. Just a slow, grinding collapse, systems shutting down one by one like organs failing in a body that hadn't eaten in days. The eastern generator had gone down at 0340. The backup ran until 0810, then choked on diesel that had gelled in the cold and quit. Ambient temperature outside was -22 Celsius and dropping with the wind. Inside the main structure, the temperature hovered just above freezing. Not because of any heating system, because 17 human bodies occupied roughly 900 square feet, and human bodies, even broken ones, still put out heat. 17. That was what remained of the 31 personnel who had been assigned to Kestrel 6 days ago. 14 had gone out, 2 supply runs that never came back, 1 medevac attempt that turned around when the pilot reported tracer fire from 3 directions. 11 on the 3rd day, when the northern perimeter was breached and Corporal Marcus Webb held the gate alone for 6 minutes until someone could relieve him. Webb survived. 3 of the 11 didn't. The remaining 17 were in varying states of usable. Captain Rachel Voss sat in the corner of what had been the communications room. The radio array was dark, had been dark for 18 hours. The antenna array had taken a direct hit from a rocket-propelled grenade on the night of the 3rd day, and without power to run the backup SatLink, Kestrel was an island, no signal out, nothing coming in except wind and cold and the occasional distant crack of a rifle. She was 34 years old. She had been deployed 4 times. She had never been in a situation like this one, and the specific quality of her fear, not the quantity. She had felt fear before, but the quality was something she had no language for. Specialist Tommy Hargrove crouched beside the eastern window, his rifle resting across the sill. He was 22. He had a face that looked younger than that, and the cold had bitten red patches into his cheeks that made him look younger still. "How many do you make it?" he asked. Hollis didn't answer immediately. He raised his binoculars. Through the white chaos of the storm, he could see barely, in fragments between Gust's movement on the northern ridge, dark shapes, patient shapes. "At least 40, he said finally. Hargrove was quiet for a moment. "Sergeant," he said, "don't. I know what you're going to say." Hollis lowered the binoculars. "Don't say it." Hargrove didn't say it, but everyone in that room had already thought it. The math was not complicated. 17 personnel, of whom perhaps 9 could hold a rifle without shaking. 40 enemy fighters, well-armed, well-positioned, patient enough to wait out the worst hours of the storm and attack when the defenders were most exhausted. They had perhaps 6 hours before those shapes on the ridge decided the moment was right. Private First Class Jonah Reyes was sitting against the far wall, his left arm bandaged from elbow to shoulder, his eyes open and pointed at the ceiling. He was 19. He had been 19 for 11 days. Before this deployment, he had never been outside the continental United States. "We're not going to make it," he said. Not dramatically, not loudly. Just a flat statement of observation, the way a person might note that the coffee had gone cold. Nobody argued with him. Captain Voss closed her eyes. She was running the numbers again, angles of approach, defensive positions, fields of fire. How long 9 able-bodied soldiers could hold 3 choke points against 40, and none of the numbers came out right. She had run them 30 times in the last 4 hours. They never came out right. The wind screamed against the wall. Snow drove through the gap where the duct tape had fallen. Hollis was still watching the ridge when the shape appeared. Not one of the enemy. The enemy were on the ridge, to the north. This shape came from the east, out of the widest part of the storm, moving with a steadiness that was almost wrong, too deliberate, too unhurried, in weather that should have made deliberate motion impossible. He pressed the binoculars harder to his eyes. A figure. Alone. Moving toward the base. He blinked snow from his lashes and looked again. "Captain," he said. His voice came out different than he intended. Voss opened her eyes. She came out of the storm the way a thought arrives, without announcement, without warning, simply present where a moment ago there had been nothing. The Eastern Gate guard, Private Gerald Fitch, had his rifle up before she covered half the distance. He was cold enough that his hands weren't entirely reliable, but his training held. He put the muzzle on her and shouted. She didn't stop. She didn't raise her hands. She didn't slow down. She walked with the unhurried, economical stride of someone who had covered distance like this many times before, body angled slightly into the wind, boots finding solid purchase in the drifted snow without hesitation. She wore no unit patch, no brassard. The white and gray winter camouflage she wore was unmarked, and Fitch, staring at her over his rifle, couldn't identify the pattern. Across her back, secured with a single quick-release strap, was a rifle that Fitch had never seen in person. Long, very long. The barrel wrapped in white cloth tape that had frayed at the ends, worn with use. The scope was enormous, matte black, and had a small lens cap dangling open on one side. "Identify yourself," Fitch shouted again. She stopped 3 feet from him. Up close, she was not what he expected. She was perhaps 30, perhaps older. Weather and experience made the number hard to read. Her face was pale and angular, and her eyes, when she met his, were the gray of overcast sky above water. Calm. Utterly, abnormally calm. She said nothing. "Name and unit," Fitch said. "Now." She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked past him, toward the main building, and her eyes moved with a practiced efficiency, cataloging, measuring, prioritizing. She was reading the base the way Fitch read a map. Captain Voss had come out by then, Hollis at her shoulder. "Who are you?" Voss asked. The woman's eyes moved to the northern ridge. In the storm, the shapes there were invisible to the naked eye, but she looked toward them with the certainty of someone who had already known they were there before she arrived. She unslung the rifle from her back with a single fluid motion and held it at her side. "How many wounded can walk?" she said. Her voice was low and measured, not unfriendly, not anything, particularly, the voice of a person who used words as precisely as ammunition, only what was necessary, only when it counted. Voss stared at her. "Excuse me." "Walking wounded," the woman said again. "How many?" "7, Hollis said, before he knew he was going to. She nodded. Just once. She was already looking at the base's layout, the observation tower on the southeast corner, 3/4 destroyed, still standing to perhaps 40 feet. The angle it offered to the northern approach. Fitch still had his rifle on her. Staff Sergeant Leonard Briggs, who was 46 and had been in the Army for 24 years and had seen more things than he usually discussed, put his hand on Fitch's barrel and pushed it gently down. "Private," Briggs said quietly. Fitch looked at him. Briggs's expression was strange. Not fear, not quite recognition. Something between the two, the look of a man who had heard a story told around a fire and was now standing inside the story. "Leave her be," Briggs said. The woman was already moving toward the tower. "What's her name?" Fitch asked. Briggs watched her go. "Some of the guys from 3rd Battalion used to talk about a call sign," he said slowly. "Echo Zero." He paused. "I thought they were making it up." Voss looked at him sharply. "What is Echo Zero?" "A ghost sniper," Briggs said. "Unattached, no unit, no rank, just appears when a position is about to fall." He paused again. "Always alone." The woman reached the base of the tower and began to climb. She climbed through the broken section with the ease of someone who had assessed the structural damage from 30 meters away and already mapped her route. In under 2 minutes, she reached the platform at the top, a 3-foot square section of flooring that tilted at 15 degrees where the supports below had partially collapsed. She stood on it without holding anything. She looked north. From below, Voss watched her and felt something shift in the room's collective atmosphere, something she couldn't name and didn't entirely trust. Not hope, not yet, too fragile and too dangerous for that word. But something. The woman's voice came down from the tower, flat and carrying even over the wind. They will not advance another step. Commander Brett Harlan was not a man who underestimated opponents. He had learned that lesson in his 3rd year of operational work, when he had been overconfident about a patrol and paid for it in 3 men and 2 days, in a cold ditch waiting for the search to pass. He had not made that mistake again. He planned, he counted, he assessed. He had 41 men. He had counted the defenders 3 times via reconnaissance and confirmed 17, of whom at minimum 6 were non-ambulatory. He had 3 attack vectors mapped through the storm's natural channels, where the wind created relative corridors of reduced visibility. He had timed his attack for the hour when the cold was deepest and the defenders most depleted. He was not going to fail. He had the binoculars out and was doing a final check on the eastern wall when he stopped. "Voigt," he said. Corporal Ernst Voigt took the binoculars. "On the tower," Harlan said. Voigt looked. He was quiet for a moment. Then he lowered the binoculars, looked again with naked eyes, and raised them again as if to confirm. "Is that Alone?" "Appears so." Voigt handed the binoculars back. Around them, several of the other men had gathered, and word was passing through the group in the quick, whispered way of soldiers who have nothing to do but wait and watch. "One sniper," said a man named Greer. He was grinning. "One sniper, and she's a woman." Laughter moved through the group. Not loud, disciplined enough to stay quiet, but real laughter, the genuine kind, carrying the weight of the absurdity of the situation. "What are they thinking?" someone said. "They're desperate," another voice answered. "This is what they have left." "1 bullet," said Greer. "That's all it takes. 1 bullet, and she's gone. And then there's nobody left." Harlan put the binoculars down. He was not laughing. Not because he didn't feel it, the situation was absurd, 1 lone sniper against 41 men, but because Harlan had learned to distrust absurdity in combat. Things that looked simple tended to become complicated. "Set up suppression on the tower," he said. "Once we're in motion, she's the first target." "She won't even get a shot off," Greer said. "She won't need to," said a quieter voice. That was Kellner. Elliot Kellner, their own counter-sniper. A laconic specialist from the northern units who rarely spoke and was generally right when he did. He had been looking at the tower through his own optics. Everyone looked at him. "What?" Greer said. Kellner lowered his scope. "The way she's standing," he said. He said nothing more. But his expression had changed, just slightly, and Greer's laughter faded as he tried to read it. Harlan looked at the tower again. The figure stood absolutely still. The wind was driving snow sideways at perhaps 60 kilometers an hour, and she stood as though it weren't happening, the rifle hanging at her side, her head turning very slowly as she mapped the ridgeline. She wasn't looking toward where his men were positioned. She was looking at where they would be. "Move up the schedule," Harlan said. His voice had changed slightly. "We go in 20 minutes. We said 40. I said 20. He turned from the ridge. "And someone put Kellner on point counter-sniper, now." Behind him, Greer was still looking at the tower. The woman hadn't moved. She stood on the broken platform in the white hell of the storm, and something about the stillness of her made the laughter feel further away than it had a moment ago. 10 minutes, Greer said under his breath. "We end this in 10 minutes. He watched her for another moment. Then he looked away first. Inside the base, the minutes stretched. "Why isn't she shooting?" Hargrove said. He had been saying it, in various forms, for 40 minutes. Nobody answered him anymore. But the question lived in the room, pressing against the walls. The base's functional defenders, 9 people, rifles, roughly 3,000 rounds of combined ammunition, were positioned at the 3 choke points. Eastern Gate, Northern Wall, the collapsed section of the southern approach. They were waiting for Voss's signal. But Voss was watching the tower. The woman hadn't fired, hadn't moved, except for the slow periodic scanning motion of her head. She had been on the platform for 47 minutes, in temperature that should have made fine motor control impossible, and she had not shifted her position by more than a few inches. "She's waiting," Briggs said. "For what?" Briggs didn't answer. Hollis was watching through the spotting scope, one of the few optical instruments they had that was still functional. He was watching the storm, reading it. "Wind's doing something," he said quietly. Voss looked at him. "Bashing around the ridgeline, it's creating cross currents." He tracked it slowly. There's a corridor shifts every 4 or 5 minutes. When it does, there's maybe a 30-second window where the snow visibility opens up just for that direction. Voss thought about that. She's timing it, Voss said. Hollis nodded slowly. The storm was a living thing, and the woman on the tower was reading it the way a navigator reads water, the subtleties of its movement, the patterns beneath the chaos. The wind came around the ridge in a specific spiral, and at the apex of each cycle, it cleared a lane, briefly, like a door opening. In that door, a target became visible, and a bullet traveling through that corridor rather than against it would arrive with precision instead of deviation. She was waiting for the door. Reyes, from his position against the wall, had propped himself up slightly. His wounded arm was useless, but his eyes were clear. "How long has she been out there?" he asked. 52 minutes, Hollis said. In this cold? Nobody spoke. Outside, the storm was relentless. -24, dropping, the kind of cold that didn't discriminate. It went after equipment, after morale, after the fine tendrils of concentration and focus that separated a good shot from a miss. The kind of cold that made even strong people fold in on themselves. And she stood there, still, waiting. Hollis watched the wind, watched the corridor form, watched her head stop moving. He saw, from a distance of 40 meters, the almost imperceptible shift not of her body, but of the rifle. It came up slowly, the barrel rising with the smooth inevitability of a clock hand, settling. "Here it comes," he said. The room went quiet. Her finger found the trigger. It rested there. The storm screamed. She waited. Nobody heard it. That was the thing that nobody in the base could process. At first, the gun fired, and the wind took the sound and ate it completely. And from their position inside the walls, there was simply a moment where the rifle had been pointed in one direction, and then there was a figure on the northern ridge who was no longer standing. He fell sideways, slowly, the way snow falls sideways in a crosswind. Hargrove pressed his face to the window. "Did she?" "Yes," Voss said. Through the ridge scope, Hollis watched the reaction with clinical attention. The enemy formation, which had been advancing in 3 disciplined lines toward the approach points, simply stopped. The left flank hesitated. The center hesitated. For 7 seconds, 40 men stood still in a blizzard, trying to understand what had just happened without a sound to mark it. No sound. No visible muzzle flash. One of their number was down, and they couldn't identify the vector. On the tower, she had already reloaded. The bolt moved and was locked in under 4 seconds. She was still. She was waiting for the corridor again. The enemy began to scatter, spreading laterally, trying to reduce their density, looking for cover. In a flat desert, there would have been nowhere to go. But the terrain here was complex rock outcroppings, drifted snow creating berms, the remnants of what might have been a structure on the eastern ridge. They moved toward those positions. She had been watching those positions for 47 minutes. The corridor opened. She fired. A second figure went down. Reload. Wait. Corridor. Third shot. Now, the chaos in the enemy formation was audible. Even inside the base, shouted voices carried on gusts of wind, fragments of panicked communication. Hollis couldn't make out words, but he could read the formation's movement. And what he read was not the controlled spread of disciplined soldiers under fire. It was the spasm of men who couldn't identify the threat. "She's not showing them where she is," he said. "The wind is covering the barrel's signature. They can't triangulate." 4, Voss said. Hollis looked. A fourth shape had crumpled in the snow. On the tower, the woman had still not moved from her initial position. She had fired 4 rounds from a platform that was tilting under her feet in a storm that should have made a 200-meter shot difficult for a trained marksman, and each one had found its mark without a single wasted motion, without a single repositioning. Private Reyes, from his place against the wall, said something very quietly. Fitch leaned toward him. "What?" "She's hurting them," Reyes said. Fitch looked at him. "Every shot, look where they're going. She's not just shooting the ones she can hit. She's pushing the others into the terrain she wants them in." Reyes paused, his face pale and intent. "She's moving them like pieces." Fitch looked at the ridge. The enemy formation, scattered into apparent random chaos, was actually compressing. Slowly, shot by shot, The path of least resistance, the direction they ran when the shooting came, was funneling them into the eastern approach corridor, into a single choke point, into a kill zone she had identified from the tower before she fired the first shot. "She's been planning this since she got here," Fitch said. From the tower, another shot. No sound. Another shape fell. By the fifth shot, the enemy's communication had broken down. Harlan's voice was somewhere in the wind, commanding, reforming, trying to reassemble the tactical shape that had dissolved the moment the shooting started. His men were trained. They responded to his voice and the voices of the section leaders. Within 4 minutes, they had stopped the lateral scatter and were consolidating. But consolidating where she had driven them. Hollis watched this from below and felt something that he could only identify as professional awe, an emotion he had not expected to feel this day, or perhaps ever. She was not simply shooting well. She was thinking 3 moves ahead in conditions where most trained snipers would have been happy to land a single shot. She had used the storm's corridor to time her shots, but she had also used the gaps between shots as tools. When she didn't fire, the enemy moved in a specific direction because that direction felt safer. She had manipulated the silence as precisely as she had manipulated the trigger. "She's pushing them into the eastern approach," Briggs said. He had come to stand beside Hollis and was watching through a secondary optic. "She wants them in the open ground between the ridgeline and the eastern wall." "Why?" Hargrove asked. "Because that's where the wind corridor holds longest." Briggs's voice was quiet, almost reverential. "In the rest of the terrain, the wind is too variable for reliable long shots. But that open ground between the rocks and the wall, the wind goes through there in one direction, consistent for 40-50 seconds at a stretch." He paused. "She has 30 seconds of reliable corridor, and she can use all 30 of them." Inside the base, something had changed. It wasn't hope yet. It was the predecessor to hope, the moment when the body begins to believe that survival is possible before the mind has fully committed to it. Hargrove was still at the window, but he wasn't holding the windowsill with white-knuckled hands anymore. Reyes had pushed himself to a sit. Fitch was leaning forward instead of pressing himself against the wall. 7 shots. 7 shapes that had stopped moving in the snow. From 33. Hollis tracked the movement on the ridge and felt the numbers shift. Not fixed anymore. Not inevitable. Private Fitch was watching the enemy through the north window and trying to understand the geometry of what he was witnessing. He had been to sniper school for 2 weeks, not enough to qualify, not enough to fully appreciate the craft, but enough to know what the distances meant. The storm corridor she was using was at least 300 meters. Some of the shots, based on the position of the fallen, were closer to 500. In these conditions, in this wind, without adjustment, without repositioning, he turned from the window. His face had changed. The hollowness that had been in it since day 3, the specific blankness of a person who has accepted a bad outcome and is simply waiting for it to arrive, was gone. Something had replaced it that he didn't have the vocabulary for yet. Voss saw it. She had been watching her people as much as watching the ridge, because the condition of her people was tactical information. What she saw in Fitch, she also saw, in varying degrees. In the others, not relief, not yet, but the recalibration of possibility. The subtle, physical shift that happens when the body's threat processing calculates a changed probability. Reyes had his good arm braced on his knee and was sitting forward now, his eyes sharp. "She's been doing this for years," he said. "This is an instinct. This is built. You don't get that precise under these conditions without..." "Without what?" Hargrove said. "Without losing something first," Reyes said, "and spending the years after filling that space with skill." Nobody argued with that. Hollis tracked the movement on the ridge and felt the numbers shift. Not fixed anymore, not inevitable. Then Briggs said, very quietly, "Echo 0. Voss looked at him. "That's the call sign," Briggs said. "From the 3rd Battalion story. Sniper went dark after a failed extraction. Her whole unit got pulled out and she didn't make the evac window. She survived 2 days alone in the field. When she came out, she was different." He paused. "That's what the guys said. Like something had been burned out of her and replaced with something else. She processed. She calculated. She waited. And she never missed." "Who does she work for?" Voss asked. "Nobody," Briggs said. "That's the point. She appears when things are at the worst. Nobody dispatches her. Nobody briefs her. He looked at the tower. She reads the signals somehow. The frequencies of a position that's failing. And she comes. Voss was quiet. Outside, the wind screamed its one continuous note. On the tower, the woman fired again. 8. Kellner had been watching for 30 minutes. He was good. He was arguably the best counter-sniper in the northern units, a title that had come to him through the quiet accumulation of confirmed work and the lack of competing claimants. He had a stillness to him that approached the professional level, could hold position for long periods in bad conditions, could read shot trajectories from impact signatures. He had been trying to triangulate Echo Zero's position for 30 minutes. He could not do it. The wind, which she was using so precisely as a tool, was also the perfect counter to his analysis. Every time he thought he had a line on her firing location drawn back from an impact, accounting for the wind, he found it pointed to 3 different positions simultaneously, or to a position that was physically impossible, or to the empty air above the observation tower. She was using ricochet angles. Some of her shots, not all, perhaps 3 in 10, were not direct fire. They were deflections off the rock surfaces on the western edge of the eastern approach, calculating the geometry of angle and wind to bring the bullet around obstacles in a way that made triangulation from impact impossible. It was the kind of shooting that, if he hadn't seen the results, he would have dismissed as theory. "Where is she?" Greer was asking from behind him. "On the tower," Kellner said. "Then shoot the tower." "I've tried to find the angle." He paused. "She's on a section that faces east. It faces away from us. There's no shot." "Then go around." "She knows where we are," Kellner said flatly. "She's known since before she got on that tower. Any angle I can shoot her from, she's already accounted for." Greer stared at him. "What does that mean?" Kellner didn't answer. He went back to his scope. What it meant was that she had done something he had heard theorized but never witnessed. She had pre-mapped the counter-sniper problem before it arose. She had identified the positions from which a skilled counter-sniper might engage her, and she had chosen the tower location specifically because it eliminated most of those angles while preserving her field of fire. She wasn't just good at shooting. She was good at the geometry of being shot at. He shifted position, moved 30 meters north along the ridgeline, and tried a new angle. She must have seen the movement. The bullet came from a direction he hadn't expected. The angle was wrong, defying the wind corridor he thought she was using, and it hit the rock face 6 inches from his head and split, sending fragments across his left arm and cheek. He dropped below the rock. He lay there for a moment, breathing. Not panic, not quite, but something adjacent to it, the specific sensation of realizing that you are in the presence of someone operating at a level above your own. He pressed his sleeve against the cut on his arm. Minor, stinging. From somewhere in the wind, he heard nothing. No second shot to follow up. She knew he was behind the rock. She knew the rock was shelter. She hadn't wasted the follow-up. She was waiting for him to move. Kellner. Harlan's voice was close. The commander had come up beside him. "She knows I'm here," Kellner said. A pause. "Can you take her?" Kellner thought about the geometry, thought about the wind, thought about the position she had chosen, and what it implied about her understanding of this specific terrain. "I need a different approach angle," he said. "You have 10 minutes. He began to move. Down in the base, on the tower, the woman watched him go. She was bleeding. The rock fragment from the counterfire had caught the edge of her left shoulder, not the gun arm, not deeply, but enough to feel. She pressed her right hand briefly against the spot, checked her palm. "Acceptable." She kept the scope on the ridgeline. She said, very quietly, to no one. Finally, "Someone worth the bullet." There had been another base. Not this configuration, not this desert. The other one had been summer, or what passed for summer at altitude. 50-degree days and 30-degree nights, and a sun that burned even through cloud cover. The base had been smaller, a forward listening post rather than a fire base, and it had held 6 people. The extraction came for 5. Elise Vance, that was her name then, before the name stopped being relevant, before the call sign became the only identification that mattered, had been on an observation position 800 meters from the post when the helicopter came and went. She had seen it rise, bank north, accelerate, She had watched it become a dot and then nothing. She had understood. The timing had moved up. The enemy ground force had been closer than the intelligence said. The pilot had made a decision. She did not blame the pilot. She spent 41 hours in that field, not 40, as Briggs had heard it. 41, because the count mattered, and she had counted, and she had done the things necessary to survive them. When she walked out, she was changed in the way that Briggs had described. Something burned away, something else in its place. A clarity, a precision, a willingness to be exactly what a situation required without editorializing. She had come out of those 41 hours different in one specific, measurable way. The fear had not disappeared. She was not a person without fear, and she distrusted the concept of fearlessness as romantic self-deception. But it had been relocated, moved from the operating layer to somewhere deeper, somewhere that didn't interfere with the mechanics. The way a river is redirected underground, it still flows, it still exists, but it no longer controls the surface. The medical evaluation had found her physically sound. The psychological assessment had used words like adaptive dissociation and high-functioning compartmentalization. She had read the report once and then set it aside. The words described the shape of the thing, but not the thing itself. What the thing itself was, she had never explained to anyone. What it was, a complete, final clarity about what mattered in a given moment and what didn't. The white noise of second-guessing, of concern about outcome, of the desire to be seen and acknowledged and correctly understood, all of it had gone quiet. In its place was the problem in front of her, and the tools she had, and the time available. That was all. That was enough. She had gone back for 2 subsequent deployments with her original unit. Then the paperwork began to lose track of her, not through any act of deception on her part, but because she had become useful in a way that didn't fit the paperwork. The kind of useful that people needed to be able to deny. And somewhere in that process, she had become a story that men told around fires. Echo Zero. She appears when a position is about to fall. She had never told anyone about the 41 hours. She had never explained the call sign or confirmed its origins. She arrived where she was needed and left when the work was done, and the story accumulated around her, like snow accumulating on a silent form, covering more and more of the person underneath, leaving only the outline. Which was fine. The outline was what mattered here. She pressed the wound on her shoulder again. Still seeping. She would need to address it when this was done. When this was done, she tracked Kellner's movement through the scope. He was good, genuinely good, possibly the best she had encountered in the last 2 years. He had identified her ricochet technique within 3 engagements, which meant his understanding of shot geometry was at the professional ceiling. He was moving now to an angle she hadn't fully pre-mapped, using the collapse of a secondary rock formation she hadn't accounted for when she chose the tower. She adjusted. The storm was entering its second phase, the period after the initial fury, where the wind became more variable, the cold deepened further, and the snow changed character from driven granules to larger, wetter flakes that accumulated faster. The corridor timings would shift. Her calculations would need updating. She began updating them. Below, in the base, she heard movement, the defenders repositioning, responding to the changed threat geometry as the enemy consolidated into the eastern approach. They were doing the right things. The captain was competent. She was adapting in real time, which was all you could ask. Private Reyes, she had heard his voice, heard the assessment he'd made about the herding tactic, had understood what she was doing. That surprised her, mildly. Young soldiers often saw only the surface of things. She filed that away. The weather changed. Kellner moved. She breathed out, slow and controlled, and found him in the scope. What remained of the enemy force had reached the eastern approach. 22 men, down from 41. They had lost 19 in the engagement, 15 to Echo Zero's fire, 4 to a repositioned defensive line that Captain Voss had moved during the chaos, blocking the northern approach with overlapping fields of fire that the now depleted enemy force couldn't breach. Kellner was among the 22. He was still moving. She had not taken the shot at him yet. Not because she couldn't, because Kellner, mobile and trying to find her angle, was a more complex problem than a static target, and the calculation required certainty. She was not going to waste what she had. She counted her remaining rounds. She had fired 13. She had arrived with 14. Because the approach had been overland and weight mattered, and she had calculated the engagement requirements on the walk-in, 14 had been the number. She had used 13. She still had Kellner unresolved, and a force of 22 regrouping for a final push. 1 round. The tactical situation was changed from what it had been 2 hours ago. 22 was not 41. The defenders, re-energized and repositioned, could hold against 22 if the leadership cohesion of the enemy force broke. And leadership cohesion depended on one thing: whether the person giving orders remained standing. She swept the scope to find Harlan. She had identified him in the early minutes, the way he moved, the communication patterns of the men around him, the specific cadence of a commander in the field. He was near the rear of the approach corridor now, directing. 1,800 meters. She ran the numbers. The storm's second phase had deepened the wind variability. The corridor she had been using was less reliable. It still formed, but for shorter windows, with more lateral drift. A shot at 1,800 meters required the corridor to hold for 4 seconds. Currently, the corridor held for 2.5 to 3. Not enough. She waited. The 22 men began moving. Harlan, directing. Kellner, still hunting her position, aware she was watching him, using the movement as part of his counter, keeping her occupied with the active sniper threat while the main force closed the distance. Smart. She was aware of it. She waited for the corridor. The temperature had dropped to -29. Her shoulder had stopped seeping, but the cold had moved into the joint, and her left arm was marginally slower than her right. She adjusted her grip, compensated. The wind changed. Not the familiar pattern. Something new, a counter-rotation from the northeast, pushing against the storm's primary flow, creating a brief moment of turbulence, followed by an unusual calm. She had seen weather do this before, at altitude, in specific terrain configurations. The corridor didn't just open. It stabilized. For 6, perhaps 7 seconds. She breathed out. The rifle came up with the slowness of inevitability. The scope moved past Kellner. He was still moving, and a moving target in these conditions required leads and margins she didn't have to spare, and settled on Harlan. Standing, talking into a radio that wasn't working, trying. 1,840 meters. Wind, negligible for the duration of the window. Temperature, -29. Compensated. Target, stationary, unaware. She exhaled the last fraction of breath. The trigger broke. The bullet left the barrel. It traveled for 2.4 seconds through absolute zero wind, through visibility that was effectively nothing, through falling snow that it split without deviation. It traveled a calculated arc that accounted for the Earth's rotation, for the temperature differential between the barrel atmosphere and the target atmosphere, for the specific density of cold air at -29 versus the zero reference point she used for windage calculation. It found Harlan. He went down, and then it was over. The 22 men who had not been Harlan stood in the eastern approach and looked at each other and at their commander and at the white howling wall of weather in which a shot had come from an impossible distance without sound or warning. And the thing that broke them was not the number of their dead. They had taken losses before and continued. What broke them was the completeness of the mystery. They could not identify the threat. They could not find it. They could not answer it. They began to withdraw. Kellner was the last to move. He stood for a long moment in the approach, looking toward the tower. He lowered his scope from his eye very slowly. He could see her outline, barely. The white blur of her on the destroyed platform, 60 feet up. He held up one hand. Not surrender. Not a gesture with a clear meaning. Just acknowledgement. The outline on the tower was still. Then, after a moment, the briefest nod. He turned and walked into the white. The storm broke in the small hours. It didn't announce itself. 1 hour the snow was driving and the wind was screaming, and then, incrementally, the intensity lessened and lesser, and at some point between 0300 and 0400, Firebase Kestrel existed in something that approached silence. Not the silence of absence. The wind still moved, the cold still pressed, but the silence of aftermath. Captain Voss stood in the open air for the first time in 22 hours. The sky above the ridge was black-blue. the stars hard and very close at this altitude. The temperature was -31 and she could feel it instantly in her face, in her lungs. But she stood in it anyway and breathed it and looked at the world that was still here. "Casualties?" she asked. Hollis came up beside her. Peterson caught a ricochet from the last push. Shoulder. "He'll keep the arm." He paused. "That's it." "Theirs?" 15 confirmed down. The rest withdrew. He paused longer. Kellner was with them. "That counter-sniper, he's good." "He's alive," Voss said. She looked at the eastern tower. It was empty. "When?" she asked. "During the withdrawal, while we were focused on the retreat." Hollis's voice was carefully neutral. She was just gone. Nobody saw her leave. Voss walked toward the base of the tower. In the fresh snow at its base, there were Mark's boot prints heading east, the same direction she had come from. They led perhaps 20 feet from the tower before the wind and accumulated snow had softened them into ambiguity. And after another 10 feet, they were simply not there. At the base of the tower, half buried in new snow, she found it. A single brass cartridge case. Standard diameter, but longer than standard the specific caliber of the rifle Echo Zero had been carrying. Still slightly warm from the residual heat of the weapon, or perhaps it was simply that the snow had insulated it from the worst of the cold. Voss picked it up. She turned it in her gloved fingers. 13 shots, 1 casing left behind. Whether intentionally or simply dropped in the haste of departure, she didn't know. She closed her fingers around it. At 0617, the radio crackled. The backup satellite link had come backup temperature had risen just enough. Or a connection had re-established itself. Or simply enough time had passed. Whatever the reason, the static resolved into a voice, and the voice said words that Voss absorbed without entirely processing. "Firebase Kestrel, this is Regional Command. We have a QRF inbound to your position. ETA 47 minutes. Please confirm status." She pressed the transmit button. "Regional Command, this is Kestrel Actual. We are standing. 17 personnel. We have wounded in need of medevac. Threat has withdrawn." A pause. "Kestrel Actual. Confirmed. QRF en route." Another pause. "Kestrel, who held that position? We lost your signal 12 hours ago." She looked out the eastern gate, toward the direction of the footprints that had ceased to be footprints. "We did," she said. She released the transmit button. Briggs was standing nearby. He had heard. "She came," he said, quietly. "She came," Voss said. Fitch came out of the main building, pulling on gloves. He looked toward the tower, then at Voss. "Is she gone?" He was quiet for a moment. "What's her name?" he asked. "Her real name." Voss opened her hand and looked at the cartridge case. "We don't know," she said. Hargrove, behind him, looked at the horizon, the eastern ridge, empty, the sky lightening at its edge to a pale and fragile gray that might, eventually, become morning. "She'll come back," he said. Hollis looked at him. "You think?" "When another position is at the edge," Hargrove said. "When there's nowhere left to go and no one left to call." He looked at the sky. "She'll come back." The wind moved through the empty tower. Reyes, standing in the doorway on his good arm and bad, looked east. He thought about what he had said in the dark hours. "We're not going to make it," and the flat certainty with which he had said it. He had meant it. He had believed it with the completeness of a person who has run the numbers and found them conclusive. And then, a figure had walked out of a white wall and proven the numbers wrong without argument, without announcement. He thought about what that meant. Not about her specifically, about what it said about numbers. About conclusions. About the specific failure mode of intelligent people under stress, which was to mistake the current available information for all possible information. She had been the information he didn't have. She was always the information someone didn't have. He stood in the doorway and breathed the cold air of morning and felt, with odd clarity, that he was going to be fine. Not just today. In general, in the long arrangement of subsequent days that he had, 2 hours ago, been quite certain he would not have. Somewhere past the ridge, past the territory that had been contested, past the white miles of this high, cold desert, a figure moved through the early gray of morning, moving at the same unhurried, economical pace. Not hurrying, not hiding, exactly. Simply moving. The new snow covered each step as it was taken. 40 yards, 20, 10. Then nothing, only unbroken, white, stretching to the horizon, unmarked, as though she had never been there, as though she had always been there, as though the distinction didn't matter. Later, when the QRF landed and the officers came and went, and the debrief was conducted and the forms were filled, someone would ask, who held Firebase Kestrel during the 18-hour blackout period when the position was surrounded by a force of 41 and the defending personnel numbered 17? The reports would say, Firebase Kestrel personnel. The reports would not mention the tower. The reports would not mention the 14 shots, 13 spent, one remaining of a caliber that did not appear on any requisition document for that position. They would not mention the call sign. They would not mention the 17 footprints in the snow, heading east, that had already been buried by the time the first QRF boots touched down. Official memory is careful. It keeps what it can use and releases what it cannot categorize. The stories, though the stories that passed between soldiers in the low hours of cold deployments, the things men said in positions that were running out of options and time, those were different. Those were not curated. Those accumulated in the way that true things accumulate, by repetition and survival, by the weight of being told again and again in places where words had to be worth something. Echo 0. She appears when a position is about to fall. She comes from no unit. She takes no orders. She leaves no record. Some wars are held together by the things that don't appear in any report, by the presence that a position's survivors can barely describe, a figure on a broken tower in the white heart of a storm, standing still where stillness should have been impossible, waiting with the patience of something that has already decided the outcome and is simply performing the remaining steps. Briggs, in the QRF helicopter, held the cartridge case that Voss had given him. He turned it over in his fingers. He thought about the story from 3rd Battalion. The girl who had been left behind, the 41 hours, the thing that had been burned away, and what had replaced it. He thought about the way she had stood on that platform. Not brave. Bravery implies the presence of fear being overcome. What he had seen in her was something past that, a person from whom the fear component had been removed at some level, replaced not with numbness but with absolute clarity. She had seen the problem. She had walked into the problem. She had solved the problem. She had left before anyone could thank her, because thanks were not the currency she operated in. He put the cartridge in his breast pocket, against his chest. He thought about something else, too smaller, quieter. The way she had looked at Fitch when she first came through the gate. The brief, assessing glance of someone who had walked into hundreds of broken situations and could read the specific quality of each one's brokenness. She had looked at Fitch and seen a boy who was terrified and exhausted and still standing at his post, and something in her eyes had moved, not softened, exactly, but acknowledged, registered, the way a person who has been cold for a very long time registers warmth without quite letting themselves lean into it. She had seen them, all of them. She had counted them and measured them, and, on that basis, made the calculation that they were worth the walk through the storm. He didn't know if she would call that compassion. Probably not. Probably she would have a different word for it, or no word at all, preferring the precision of action over the imprecision of description. But Briggs had a word for it. He pressed his palm against his breast pocket, feeling the small, hard shape of the cartridge case through the fabric. 47 minutes west,